Thank you everyone for attending today's environmental ethics seminar. As most of you are aware, these seminars are held every semester here at UGA, and they have been since 1983 when this environmental ethics certificate program was first founded by none other than Eugene Odom and other faculty here at the University of Georgia. Eugene Odom also happens to have been responsible for the creation of the Savannah River Ecology Lab, where James Beasley is broadcasting from this evening. So nice connection there. And back when this certificate was created, it was the first of its type in the US, and still proud to be going strong more than 35 years later. We've got each semester between 4 and 6 seminars that we host. And in addition to seminars, the environmental ethics program also hosts several other exciting events. And of course, we welcome both people who are participating in the certificate as well as people from campus and beyond campus to join us for any of those events. So with that brief intro, without further ado, let me introduce our guest, Dr. James Beasley. Jim is the Terrell Professor in Forestry and Natural Resources at the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources and the Savannah River Ecology Laboratory. So he's got a joint appointment there. His master's and PhD are both from Purdue University, and his lab, which I'm sure we're going to hear a lot about this evening, conducts research that ranges from issues from invasive species management to the impacts of nuclear accidents on wildlife populations and more. And I was interested to read that his recent book, Invasive Wild Pigs in North America, Ecology, Impacts, and Management, which Jim was involved as a co-editor and an author, received the Book of the Year award from the National Wildlife Research Center last year. And I first heard of Jim's research a couple of years ago, and I've been following it ever since. And I'm just really thrilled that Jim is able to join us from the Savannah River Lab today. So with that, welcome, Jim. I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's really a pleasure to be with you here today, and thanks for tuning into the webinar. In my lab, we do a lot of work looking at the effects of humans and human activity on wildlife in a lot of capacities. As Alfie mentioned, from invasive species to fragmentation to contaminants, and kind of given everything that's been going on in the news and in our world today, especially over the last few weeks, I thought this would be a particularly timely topic that might be of interest to talk about today. We do a lot of work in my lab on trying to understand the impacts of the Chernobyl and Fukushima nuclear accidents on wildlife. And so that's what I decided to focus my talk on here today. And so when most people hear the words Chernobyl or Fukushima, at least prior to 5 or 6 years ago, most people had images of like this, an abandoned wasteland that's largely devoid of life. It's kind of, if there's any animals persisting, they're mutated, they're unable to survive. And one of the reasons that we have these perceptions are because of movies that are out there. There's video games out there on Chernobyl. There's just a lot of media coverage of Chernobyl. And up until a few years ago, most of that coverage has portrayed Chernobyl as this abandoned wasteland where nothing can really survive. Of course, that's led to even further interest in Chernobyl. And up until a few weeks ago, there actually was a booming and thriving tourism, a dark tourism industry that was starting to grow in Chernobyl. And I won't get into some of the implications of that for the research that was going on there, but my point is that this was starting to gain a lot of interest, and hundreds of thousands of people were coming from all over the world to go to the Chernobyl site, and particularly to visit the abandoned city of Pripyat, which, if you've kind of seen any images of Chernobyl, often there's images of the bumper cars like I showed, the Ferris wheel like you see here. Those are real common images you see. And so people are flocking from all over the world to come check out this radioactive landscape. Fast forward to a couple of weeks ago, and we have this terrible humanitarian crisis and war that's going on. And now this is the scene that we're seeing. And so Chernobyl is now starting to dominate the news again because of concerns over potential contamination and further release of radionuclides. And one of the things that so far there's been no releases, but some of you may have seen this. This is actually a pontoon bridge that was built between Belarus and Ukraine to move tanks across just in the past few weeks, and this has kicked up some radioactive dust. And so there's been some evidence of increased kind of localized radiation. And so this has all kind of renewed these concerns and fears over the consequences of further nuclear contamination from some of these sorts of events. And so the Chernobyl accident happened quite some time ago, back in the former USSR. In the middle of the night, there was a steam explosion in the Chernobyl power plant due to some faulty equipment and some human error during a training exercise. There was an explosion that basically blew the roof off the top of this reactor, like you can see here in this image here, and disseminated massive amounts of radionuclides out into the environment. And to this day, this is the worst nuclear accident in our history, hopefully the worst accident that we ever have. HBO actually did a series on the accident a couple of years ago. Some of you may have seen that. If you haven't seen it and are interested in this, you might check it out. It provides a lot of fairly accurate context around the circumstances that occurred during that accident. But we often think of the Chernobyl impacts being fairly localized around the reactor, but in reality, the accident actually disseminated radiation throughout the northern hemisphere. Those of you who may have been old enough to have been alive at that point probably recall news stories, especially in Scandinavia, where high levels of radionuclides were detected. In fact, the rest of the world learned about the accident, not because it was disclosed, but because radiological workers in Norway or Sweden or Finland, somewhere up there, had come into work with elevated levels of radiation on their dosimeters. And so that was a trigger point that people realized that something pretty catastrophic had happened somewhere in the world. And so given the severity of that accident, in the days and weeks after the accident, once it was acknowledged the severity of it, the Soviet government at that time created a human exclusion zone around the reactor. And so you can see on the left there was originally a 30-kilometer zone, so around 20-mile radius, where they basically evacuated all the people from the landscape, where they loaded them on buses and shipped them out of the landscape without any real clear guidance as to when they'd be able to return. And since then, that exclusion zone has kind of grown and expanded a little bit, and you can now see that the present day exclusion zone outlined in kind of orangish red there. And you can see that the exclusion zone pretty much equally spans the countries, the current countries of Belarus and Ukraine, with the actual power plant being slightly over the border on the Ukrainian side of the reactor, or the Ukrainian side of the border. And so they blockaded off the roads. You can see this is the exclusion zone gate, one of the gates on the Belarus side now. So these are guarded gates where you just can't go walk around there. Requires a lot of special permissions, really difficult to gain access. But this isn't fenced in like you might imagine from Jurassic Park. I mean, wildlife are allowed to come and go. It's just the people that are generally restricted from going on to this exclusion zone, with the exception of the tourism that I mentioned. And so when you drive through this landscape and are actually doing work there, I often describe it as an emotionally polarizing experience. On the one hand, you have this beautiful landscape, birch trees, abundant wildlife in certain areas, but you also have these tragic reminders of the human lives that were impacted to some capacity, not necessarily in terms of direct loss of life, but hundreds of thousands of people were displaced from their homes to forever not be able to return. And so this is is really a scenario where we've got some potential positive benefits for wildlife, but some real tragedies in terms of human impacts. And so we've had several decades now since the accident where the landscape's basically been allowed to regenerate. And so much of the landscape prior to the accident looks something like this, these small little rural agricultural villages where you had clusters of towns and clusters of houses in these small towns. These were agricultural communities, had a few livestock, had a few crops growing in their backyard. And since that time, the vegetation's basically started to reclaim the landscape. These areas are being kind of overgrown with old fields. You may have seen images of some of the cities where the trees are growing up right through the cities, up through the buildings in some cases. And so over the last few decades, the vegetation has really started to encroach and kind of reclaim the land for itself. And so I kind of wanted to start the research part of this talk with talking a little bit about what we know, because there's a lot of confusion and controversy surrounding some of the aspects of what's going on in Chernobyl. And so one of the things that we do know is right after the accident, there were some severe initial effects to some of the biota there. And in the foreground here of this image, you have the red forest. This is a really famous forest. In the background, you can see the reactor. So it's fairly close to the reactor. And these are pine trees, and pine trees are very sensitive to radiation exposure. And this whole pine forest was basically killed off from radiation exposure right after the accident. And so because of that, they went in, cut down the trees, buried them in sand. And so now we have a very transformed landscape in this one little portion. It's only about 1% of the exclusion zone, but it's highly transformed. But because it's so contaminated, it's often used as an experimental site for a lot of studies. But keep in mind that this is a site that's been heavily modified, in terms of habitat. And so just from a habitat perspective alone, we might expect some potential shifts in wildlife populations because of that. We also know that due to radioactive decay, the dose rates in Chernobyl are now about 100 times lower than they were right after the accident. So many of the radionuclides that were released were very short-lived. Radioactive iodine, for example, which is known to cause thyroid cancer, that has very short half-life, and other radionuclides really quickly dissipated in the days, weeks, and months, and in some cases, first couple of years after the accident. And what we're left with now are some of the longer-lived radionuclides that will persist for hundreds or thousands of years. So even though dose rates are much lower, this isn't to suggest it's not contaminated. It's still one of the more contaminated locations on Earth. But there are a number of places within the exclusion zone now where the dose rates that you might get are not that dissimilar from certain high elevation areas in parts of the world. And so this really creates a challenge when trying to disentangle some of the effects of radiation, because we have these legacy generations that were exposed to radiation, but current generations are exposed to much lower levels of radiation than some of their ancestors. And the other thing that I'll mention is that there was no protection for wildlife. So people were moved out, but wildlife were allowed to persist. A lot of the domestic animals were euthanized, but wildlife have persisted, and we know that they accumulate very high levels of radiation in their bodies. So these are just some data from the Belarus portion of the exclusion zone that were collected. I think these are from the late 90s. And that red line represents the European Economic Commission level for human consumption. And just as a reference, that value is 600 becquerels per kilogram. And here we have, individuals that are 50,000 or 100,000 becquerels per kilogram. So these are highly contaminated animals. They're exposed to high levels of radiation. And so that's really brought about this complex dynamic of trying to understand whether or not there are any prolonged population, individual, or molecular level effects. And there's been studies that have found effects. There have been studies that have found no effects. And one of the concerns that's been raised is some of the studies that have found effects at levels of radiation exposure that are similar to background levels in some other countries. And so this has really spurred a lot of interest within the scientific community to try and understand what's going on in these landscapes. This is a truly remarkable living laboratory to conduct experiments, but we have these complex ecological systems that make it difficult to disentangle certain attributes from another. Complicating this even further is that they've actually introduced some wildlife into these exclusion zones. So the Schwalski's horse there on the left, some of you may have heard of this animal. It's one of the most endangered large animals on Earth. It's only found in a couple places in the wild today. And one of those places is Chernobyl, where the population was introduced in the late 1990s. And I'll talk a little bit more about them in the future. We also have the European bison, another species of conservation concern. So the horses were introduced into Ukraine. The bison were introduced into the Belarus portion of the exclusion zone back in the late 90s as well. So this has really created this unique paradox where there are these competing views as to whether or not Chernobyl might be serving as an ecological sink or potentially a nature reserve where animals can survive, and we can even use it to conserve populations of threatened and endangered species. And so there have been agency reports and scientific papers that have basically proposed both of these ideas, with one scientific paper calling Chernobyl the largest ecological sink on the planet. And so this is what really spurred my interest in this. As I moved to UGA about 10 years ago, working on Chernobyl and subsequently Fukushima became pretty high priorities to me as I began to kind of dig into what we know and what we don't know about wildlife in these areas. And one of the things that became really clear early on is that prior to a few years ago, there were very few published studies on mammals, and particularly large mammals in Chernobyl. And so we really did not have a good understanding of how populations were impacted from these accidents. We also know little about how radiation influences where these animals are on the landscape. There are papers that suggest animals can avoid radiation or populations are suppressed, but there's not a lot of data to back that up. And one of the other things that was a major data gap is understanding the spatial and temporal variability of radiation exposure. And so often when people are doing health assessments of wildlife, they'll catch an animal and make some general assessments about what its radiation exposure might be, given some hypothetical scenarios about home range or movement. But we really, there's not been a lot of good abilities, good technologies to actually quantify radiation exposure over prolonged periods of time. And so that was something that we set out to try and tackle as well, with ultimately trying to understand what the potential implications are from a population level to an individual level, and ultimately at a molecular level, what's going on with particularly mammals in these landscapes. So much of the research that I'm going to talk about in the first half of this talk, or first 2/3 of this talk on Chernobyl, comes from research that we've done at the Polyacy State Radiation Ecological Reserve, which is the portion of the exclusion zone in Belarus. This is a little bit more remote than the Ukrainian side. There's been a lot less research activity, particularly by Western research scientists. And because of the prevailing winds at the time of the accident, as you can see here on this figure, a lot of the radiation actually fell in the Belarus portion of the exclusion zone. And so this is where we've concentrated a lot of our efforts in trying to understand some of these aspects of population responses. And so back in 2012 is when we made our first trip over to Chernobyl to try and get some studies going there, and quickly learned that this was an incredibly complex and difficult landscape to work in. It's not the sort of environment where you can just get off a plane and start a research program. It actually took a number of years for us to secure the goodwill of the local scientists, the permits to do the work, the permissions from the ministry, and all of those things. But in the interim, we ended up forging some great partnerships with a number of scientists over there. And one of the first things that we did was really dig into some data that were collected right after the accident. And so this was actually, I found quite remarkable. In the first year after the Chernobyl accident, remember, this is when radiation levels were the highest. This was a major humanitarian crisis at that time. And some of the biologists at that time had the foresight to actually start some population surveys of wildlife. And none of this had been published previously in peer-reviewed journals. And so we actually dug into their data. And for this particular study, what they ended up doing is in the first decade after the accident, they went in over the exclusion zone in helicopters and flew over these 3 different study areas, as you can see, that represent varying levels of contamination. And during wintertime, they did counts of large mammals. This is a standard tool that we use, particularly in the Western United States, to count numbers of animals and do population surveys. And we initially expected to see some pretty low numbers of animals on these surveys, but much to our surprise, what we ended up seeing is that populations of all the species that were documented, moose, roe deer, which are kind of similar to a white-tailed deer, and wild boar, all increased quite substantially in that first decade after the accident. So they did these surveys for 10 years, and we see really steady population growth at that time. The only exception is in 1994, the boar population declined quite substantially. This was not due to radiation or anything. There was a disease outbreak that hit that population at that time, and the population subsequently rebounded. And so this was quite surprising. We have this extremely contaminated landscape right after the accident, yet populations of some of these large mammals are increasing. So the next question that we became interested in is trying to understand whether or not those increases in populations were being primarily driven by populations on the periphery of the exclusion zone. And so were all these increases being driven by increases at the border where the contamination levels were lower. And so what we ended up doing here is using track surveys. And so these are, again, another standard tool that we use in wildlife research. And so after a fresh snow, you walk transects and count the number of tracks and identify them to species. And so this was done over several hundred kilometers over a several year period. And you can see that these transects in green here, they encompass kind of a whole gradient of contamination. And what we did is look to see what habitat attributes were associated with all these detections and what the radiation levels were in those areas. And we developed a number of models, and I'm just going to show 4 species here just for space, but all the species that we looked at, which was I think 17 or 18, nearly 24, the relationship looks just like this in terms of radiation and relative abundance. So you can think of these track counts as a relative index of abundance. And what you can see across the board here is there's absolutely no negative relationship in terms of where we find these animals and radiation levels. In fact, what we end up seeing is that habitat is driving where we find these animals. Wherever there's suitable habitat, those are the most important variables in our model. So these animals are their distribution is being influenced by habitat, not by radiation on this landscape. So now we know that populations are increasing after the accident, and we know that animals are widely distributed throughout the landscape, but that still doesn't address the question of whether or not these populations are still suppressed compared to other nature reserves. And so what we did here was we went in and looked at the same track count data that I just talked about that were collected for Chernobyl. Those same standardized surveys are conducted throughout all the national parks in Belarus, all the nature parks there. And this is kind of a busy figure. So if you just focus on the dark bars at the end, the black bars, those are the Chernobyl data. And what you can see across the board for all these species, the number of animals, the relative abundance in Chernobyl is pretty much as high or higher in Chernobyl than all the other nature reserves. And so collectively, this suggests that not only are populations increasing, but they're pretty widely distributed throughout the exclusion zone, and they're at relatively similar abundances now compared to other protected areas in that part of the world. And one of the things that I'm going to come back to later are these data for the wolves. So wolves were about 7 times more abundant in these surveys in Chernobyl than the other nature reserves. And this is important for a number of reasons. One, all these other species that I'm showing here are some of the primary prey of wolves. So their populations actually might be suppressed in Chernobyl compared to what they potentially could be. But wolves are actually a species that has a lot of potential for in terms of large mammal research. And so a lot of our research program that I'll talk about in a minute has focused on these wolves. And so once we were finally able to go over there, we started a whole series of different studies. And some of the studies we started right up front were camera studies to try and validate some of these species distribution models and some of these habitat models. And so on the left there, that's again a map of the PSRER exclusion zone, and those green dots represent cameras that we placed out there on the landscape. This was specifically a carnivore survey to try and use some different tools, some more modern technology to try and validate some of those findings that we found based on the track counts. And then on the right here, we've got a scavenging study. This is a study that was done along canals and river systems there. Scavenging camera work is another good tool to try and understand the species composition, the species diversity, the efficiency of a community in terms of how they're able to kind of clean up carrion from the landscape. And so we did a number of different camera studies to try and tackle this question in a couple of different ways. And here's just a real quick video, just to, it's just 15 or 20 seconds to show you just a couple of the different species that I wanted to highlight here. This one here is one of those roe deer, like I mentioned. You can see they look similar to white-tailed deer, except their antler structure is a little different. There's a Eurasian lynx. There's a moose and a red deer. There's a red fox. Here's a wolf. There's actually a collared wolf you'll see there. It's wild boar, European bison. That's a raccoon dog, which I'll talk about in a minute. And some wolves kind of rolling on some of our scent stations. And so, through these studies, we documented a huge diversity of different species. And when you actually analyze the data, what we see is that radiation has no influence on where we find them on the landscape. Again, it boils down to habitat. Species that rely on forested habitat, you find them where there's forest, regardless of whether it's highly contaminated or not. Species that rely on wetlands, you find them where there are wetlands. And again, just like the track data, we see a very widespread distribution of these species, including many of the more contaminated areas. And for some species, we actually see a positive association with radiation. In other words, more abundant in areas of higher radiation. And I'll get to this in a minute. It has nothing to do with the fact that they're attracted to the radiation. It has more to do with other sorts of factors that are contributing to those animals' movements. Again, with the scavenging studies on the left here, it just shows kind of the distribution of those cameras throughout the landscape. And this was actually some pretty remarkable findings as well. So we put out these carcasses in the late fall, early winter time, and 99% of them were scavenged within 1 week. And so just to kind of put that in comparison, I don't know that we've ever done a study where we've had almost 100% of our carcasses consumed within a week. Usually we're hovering in the 40 to 75% range, depending on carcass size. And for this carcass size, I would have expected 50 to 75%. So basically what this means is that we've got a highly efficient scavenging community there. In other words, it's not deficient of animals. There's a wide diversity of species. You can see some birds there, a raccoon dog on the upper right, mink and river otter. There's a river otter on the lower left. They were really dominant scavengers. Again, we use fish carcasses here, so that would be expected. So again, this is all building on this story, building on this evidence that at least at a population scale, we've got a pretty diverse community that's abundant and widely distributed. And there's even been some interesting observations of natural colonization. So I mentioned the intentional introductions, but there's actually been some natural colonizations that have been well described in kind of the media recently, as well as another one here. So in the upper left, we've got the Eurasian Links. At the time of the accident, it's believed that Eurasian Links were not found in the exclusion zone just to the abundance of people. And this is a lynx that we actually caught in our foothold trap there. You can see the trap. We actually released it and just sat there and watched us for a little bit. Lynx, are quite abundant now in this landscape. We get them on our cameras all the time. This is a brown bear on the right. There's been a few brown bears that have been observed in the Ukrainian side of the exclusion zone. This is an image of one on the Belarusian side, and there's other images as well. And so now it's believed that there are several brown bears that have colonized the exclusion zone that are actually resident there and are establishing a population. So, pretty remarkable examples of large apex carnivores colonizing these areas on their own. And on the bottom left, that we believe is a European wildcat. We're still trying to verify that. If that is true, that would be the first documented case of this species in Belarus, in at least that part of Belarus, in almost a century. They're found in Ukraine, and so it's possible this is just a dispersing male that was caught on camera. But either way, just another example of animals potentially moving into that landscape. And so now, real briefly, I wanted to kind of just highlight these horses. As I mentioned, the Schwalski's horse, this is a species that was extirpated in the wild. There were no wild horses by the 1970s. They were all found in zoos and in breeding farms. And since that time, they've established 6 introduced populations, one of which was established in the Chernobyl exclusion zone in 1998. And so there were 21 individuals introduced at that time. I don't know what the current population is. Last I knew, it was in the upper 90s. So population has grown quite considerably. But for a species this endangered, I've been really amazed at how limited the research has been on monitoring its populations. There's been very little work kind of quantifying changes in demography, genetic diversity, the population dynamics, or their behavior. And one of the things that we wanted to do is try and figure out if there are potentially easy ways to study these horses, because it's a species that's so endangered, it's difficult to capture and handle. You can't get proper anesthetics in either of these countries to work with them. It's just a very logistically challenging environment to work on an animal of this size. And so we've been exploring more creative ways of trying to do some of these studies. And one of the things that we've started to do is to actually put cameras in some of these abandoned barns. It became very clear to us that some of these species are actually using these abandoned structures. I've been in abandoned houses there and seen wild boar farrowing nests, which is where they give birth and raise their young. We've seen owls roosting in houses, raccoon dogs denning in houses, and we've seen wolves and other animals moving through these barns. And we also see a lot of horse scat in these barns. And so we set up cameras on these barns to try and figure out whether there are any times a year these horses are using them, how much they're using them. Could these be a potential focal point for camera studies to try and do some population surveys? And so here's another real quick video that I'll show some horses that have entered one of these barns. We actually saw use of, I think we monitored 10 barns. I think we had horses use 9 of the barns. These are actually taking a nap in the barns. Here we have a lynx in here, probably hunting for rodents. We've got moose. These are red deer, similar to our elk, even big bull moose, wild boar, wolves. All these large animals are using these barns to some extent. And so one of the questions that we have is why, and can these be potential sources for collecting scat or hair or images to do some more non-invasive surveys of some of these large mammals. But really, a lot of our interest there, and my interest in particular, has centered on wolves. And we've initiated a whole series of studies on wolves, some of which we've published, some we're still working through at the moment. But as I mentioned, wolves are seemingly very abundant in Chernobyl. And as soon as you go into the exclusion zone and kind of work your way into the more interior portions of it, it becomes very clear that wolves are a dominant predator there. There's evidence, tracks, scat, absolutely everywhere in certain parts of the exclusion zone. And so we set out to do a number of different studies on wolves. One of the first ones was to try and estimate the population size of wolves and estimate their distribution. And this is work that's still ongoing. And we went out and basically collected scat, genotyped the scat, and tried to use that to understand where populations were more or less dense. And what you can see here from our preliminary data, this heat map, that kind of red area, represents the areas where the density seems to be highest. And just anecdotally from kind of going in there, that is where you see the most tracks, you see the most scat, you see the most evidence of wolves. And if you can kind of think back a few slides to that contamination map, this actually happens to be one of the more contaminated portions of the exclusion zone. So that seems to be where these wolves tend to be concentrating their activity. So we then set out to actually radio collar animals. So we radio collared raccoon dogs, like you can see up there on the top, and we radio collared a number of wolves. And the purpose of radio collaring the wolves and raccoon dogs was kind of multifaceted. For one, one of our main objectives was to try and understand how these animals are utilizing this abandoned landscape. Are they moving in and out of the zone? Are they concentrating in certain areas? Kind of to further validate some of those camera and track surveys. But really the main thrust of that research was to try and better quantify radiation exposure to these animals. This is a large apex predator. It moves around a lot. That landscape is highly heterogeneous in terms of radiation distribution. And so wolves are a really good model for that. The problem is there are no tools to actually do that. There are dosimeters that you can wear if you work in a power plant, for example, that can track your radiation levels. And there are GPS collars that we use routinely to track movements of animals. But there's nothing that tracks radiation levels in real time. So what we ended up doing is working with some companies to develop a new type of GPS transmitter that actually tracks radiation levels and spatial location in real time and can transmit that data at whatever interval you want through the satellites. And so I can be in my office over here and have a caller out on a wolf in Chernobyl and know where it's going, what its radiation exposure is between that fix and the previous GPS fix. And so we can really start to dig into these questions related to potential health effects and how variable their radiation exposure is. So we collared wolves on a couple of different expeditions over a few year period. And I don't have time to get into all the results, but we also looked at things like kill sites. Here's a moose. We actually had a big die-off of wild boar due to classical swine fever. It's a disease that's kind of going through a massive outbreak through Europe, including Belarus, and the boar population declined, and we saw a heavy shift to moose in terms of predation with our wolves. And there's another collared wolf up there on the left. That's a wolf that actually moved over from Belarus into Ukraine during the tracking period. But I'm not going to go into all the details on the spatial data, but these are some of the preliminary home ranges I just wanted to share. And on the north there, that dotted line is the Belarus portion of the exclusion zone. On the south, that's the Ukrainian portion. And you can see the cooling pond there. And if we were to zoom in, you could see the reactor there. And really, what should jump out at you from looking at this image is that these animals are, at least the ones that we've collared, largely concentrating their activity within these protected areas. So I should mention that in in this landscape, wolves are heavily persecuted. Dozens of them are killed every year right outside the exclusion zone. There's actually bounties on them. And so if you're a wolf, moving out into the surrounding landscape is a fairly dangerous proposition. And it seems that a lot of these wolves, even the packs that have territories that are kind of near the boundaries, they tend to concentrate their activities, inside the exclusion zone, which doesn't mean that none of the wolves leave the exclusion zone. Certainly some of the peripheral packs, I'm sure do. But in general, a lot of the packs are concentrating their activity on these reserves. And when we actually model the movements of these wolves, we see a couple really interesting things jump out. On the top figure here, we have distance to the border, and those are the first 7 wolves that we've analyzed so far. And what you can see across the board is that these animals are concentrating their activity further from the border, so into the more interior portions of the exclusion zone. And as you recall from those previous images and here on the left, this aligns with those areas that are more contaminated. And so what appears is happening here is that the wolves are likely avoiding the edges where they're likely to be persecuted, and instead favoring areas that are more interior, which just happen to be more contaminated. The other thing we see is that wolves are selecting for areas depending on the amount of forest cover on the landscape. This area is kind of mixed between abandoned old field and forest cover. And so that's the other variable that really seems to be driving the wolf movements on that landscape. And if you think back a couple slides ago to that population study we did from the SCAT, these data and the movement data, those all align very well in terms of those distributions. Now, we did have one documented example of dispersal. And so this was a young male that we collared, about a year-old male. And males in species like wolves tend to be the dispersing sex, and they'll often disperse long distances. And so these collars were programmed to take a GPS fix and radiation fix every 30 minutes. And so this animal on the left there, you can see, had a home range that was kind of concentrated in a pretty small area near the border there. And one day it just picked up and left home. And you can see its trek there moved all the way through Ukraine and over into Russia. So this animal made a huge long distance movement. This was back in 2014, I believe. And so this raised a number of questions and concerns as to, if animals are leaving Chernobyl, what are the potential implications for interbreeding with other populations and things like that. But that aside, I think what this also provides further support for is the fact that these are reproducing animals. We routinely see litters of pups or young animals on our cameras, and so these animals are reproducing it and potentially serving as source populations for the surrounding landscape. And so in terms of radiation exposure, I just wanted to throw a couple slides in here because these data are pretty interesting. So I just have highlighted on the left there 2 wolves. The top one is Eva. She's her radiation exposure was around 11 microsieverts per day. You can see her home range in light green there. That is kind of a low to moderate contaminated area within the exclusion zone. And on the bottom, we have Opie, who actually hung out near the reactor, as well as some of the most contaminated parts of the exclusion zone. And you can see that his radiation exposure is almost an order of magnitude higher than Eva's radiation. So we have 2 wolves within the same landscape experiencing almost an order of magnitude difference in radiation exposure. And so we kind of wanted to build on that and understand what that fine scale temporal variability and exposure was. And we anticipated pretty substantial variability, just given the variability on the landscape and the capability of these animals to move. But some of the variability that we're seeing even exceeds some of those expectations. And so on the graph on the right here, what you can see is that this animal, this is again that Opie individual, he's in an area hanging out. This is just a 2-week period where there's 1 to 2 microsieverts per hour. So pretty low levels of radiation, even though he's in a fairly contaminated area. These are pretty low levels of contamination. And then all of a sudden he moves to an area that's got almost 35 microsieverts per hour. And we have this cycle repeated over and over again throughout the tracking of this individual. And so what this really brings to light is that when we go in to do health effect studies and catch an animal and take some radiation measurements where we catch them, we don't know where that animal spends most of its time. We could have caught them in an area that's 1 to 2 microsieverts per hour, like where he spends a lot of his time, or maybe just by happenstance we caught him in an area that has over 30 microsieverts per hour. And our models, our assumptions would be very different in terms of our expectations in terms of radiation exposure and impacts depending on where we caught that animal. And so this basically calls into question some of the ways that we conduct risk assessments. Those are in these radiological areas done with making some pretty generic assumptions. And these data suggest that sometimes those assumptions are valid, but there's a lot of times where they may not be, and really suggest that we need to do some more detailed work like this and actually link this exposure to health effects. So I'm going to stop there. That's kind of the majority of the things that we're working on at the moment in Chernobyl, and kind of want to fast forward to 2011. After Chernobyl, we had hoped and thought there would be no other nuclear accidents, but unfortunately in 2011, in March, we had another major level 7 nuclear accident, this time caused by the Great Tsunami and earthquake. And this has been kind of buried in the news the last week or so, but some of you may have seen there actually was another tsunami in Fukushima about a week ago. I think it was ended up being a really small tsunami, didn't have any impacts, but again, it just kind of rekindled some of these concerns and some of these fears that people have. And so this was a catastrophic tsunami, tremendous loss of property and human life, and displaced hundreds of thousands of people. And on top of that, we had this devastating nuclear accident at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. And unlike Chernobyl, Fukushima is positioned right on the sea. And the kind of good and bad of that is that a lot of the radiation actually went out into the ocean, but there was substantial contamination that moved up over land, again, depending on wind and precipitation. And you can see on this map here, kind of this finger almost of high levels of radiological contamination. And so like Chernobyl, the Japanese government removed people from a really large area surrounding the reactor, and this outer green buffer that I've got highlighted, that was the original exclusion zone where they moved people out. And unlike Chernobyl, where things have kind of been let to recover to some extent on its own, in Fukushima, they've actually taken a very proactive and aggressive approach to remediation. So not only do we have natural radionuclide decay like we had in Chernobyl, but on top of that, they're going in and actually removing the topsoil in a lot of areas, like you can see down here on the lower left, and cutting down vegetation, decontaminating buildings, and really trying to reclaim a lot of this area that's been impacted. In fact, when you go in the Fukushima exclusion zone, it almost has a feel of a construction site. There are dump trucks driving by all over the place, excavators working, workers moving around the landscape. And so they're really been proactive at remediating that landscape. And because of the decay and some of those remediation efforts, they've actually reopened a pretty large portion of the Fukushima exclusion zone. So that area that's highlighted in green there is the what I'm calling the restricted area. And so this area has now been reopened for human settlement at some places as early as 2015, and they've been steadily opening areas within there since. And then you have this interior, the red area, that's 371 square kilometers, and that is still excludes people. There's not as much remediation going on there. That's an area that's been designated as the difficult to return zone. People are not going to be going back there to live for probably many decades because of the contamination level. And so it's actually set up another unique landscape to do these kind of studies. But here we have kind of a built-in control in terms of human presence. And so we've got this evacuated area that humans were removed. It's highly contaminated. And we have an area that's got pretty low levels of contamination currently that has been remediated. Radionuclides have even declined further, and people have started to move back, although only about 10% of the people have moved back. It's become very difficult to kind of rebuild some of these populations, after being removed for almost a decade. And then right next door, we also have control areas that were never evacuated. And the habitats are similar. They're in quite close proximity. You can go from one of these to the other, especially along the coast, in a pretty short period of time. And so we have this unique gradient of human presence and radiological contamination. And so we began designing a whole series of other studies to kind of mimic some of the things that we were doing in Chernobyl. And one of the first things that we did was a really comprehensive and extensive camera survey across these two different areas. And so you can probably make it out if you squint at that map, but there's the Abakuma Mountains that kind of run through the middle of the exclusion zone. And then you have this coastal area, and the coastal area is more rice farming, things of that nature, very flat landscape. And so you have slightly different species that live in these areas, or at least are distributed a little bit differently in these areas. So we created 120 sites throughout here, divided between these two areas, and then equally divided in each between the exclusion zone, the restricted area, and the control zone. So really trying to account for these radiation and human effects here on the landscape. And so these were long-term surveys, much longer than we were able to do in Chernobyl. Left these out for over 2 seasons for almost 8 months. Ended up generating millions of images, hundreds of thousands of images. And here's just a couple of the different species that occur here that I thought I'd highlight, because I'll be talking about them in a minute. On the top left, we have the Japanese macaque as a red fox coming back to a den that it had right near our camera. On the bottom left, that's a Japanese siro, similar to a mountain goat that we have here in North America. This is a really, not a spiritual animal, but a revered animal in Japan. And then, of course, wild boar, which I'll be talking quite a bit about here in a few minutes, as well as a number of other species that we detected on our cameras. And so here we looked at a whole suite of different habitat and landscape and radiation variables, as well as this zone variable. And so the zone refers to those 3 zones: the exclusion zone, the restricted zone, and inhabited zone, and ran a whole series of different models for somewhere around 15 or 20 species. And I've just highlighted a few here that had the strongest response. But across the species, radiation had no influence on where we find these animals on the landscape. Again, it comes back to habitat. But here, even more so, it comes down to zone, or the zone and elevation interaction. Remember, some of these species are predominantly occur in mountainous areas, like the Japanese siro. They're not a coastal species. We only find them down near the coast. And what you can see here, for these species, is that a few of them, we actually see much higher abundance in the evacuated areas than the control areas: wild boar, raccoons, and macaques in particular. And these 3 species have one thing in common, in that they're really detrimental in terms of human wildlife conflicts in Japan. Wild boar are, across the world, really adept at rooting up crops, damaging crops. Here in the Southeast, we do a lot of work on wild boar, just because they cause a lot of conflicts with agricultural producers. In Japan, they constantly raid crops, and because of that, they're controlled in a number of areas. Raccoons are not native to Japan. This is the same raccoon that we have here. And it's the same clever raccoon that we have here. They get into buildings, they damage crops, things of that nature. And then the macaques. I have a biased perception of primates living in North America, but over in Japan, macaques actually cause a lot of damage. They damage crops. They're an incredibly intelligent animal. They destroy property. And so they actually control populations of macaques in certain areas due to the damage that they cause. So these are three species that are routinely in conflict with people. And these are the species where we see the strongest positive response. The only exception is the Japanese Sero. Remember, this is that mountain goat-like animal. And I'll talk a little bit more about a few of these on the next few slides. So wild boar were by far the most abundant species that we detected, and almost 4 times more abundant in the exclusion zone than the area where people are still living, were never evacuated, and kind of intermediate levels in the restricted zone. So almost 4 times higher densities in the exclusion zone. And one of the things that's kind of even more remarkable about that is, boar numbers were recognized by the people who were monitoring this area, working in this area. They rapidly recognized that boar numbers were increasing. And so the government in Japan actually implemented a really extensive control program where they go in throughout these green and red areas and actually trap boar, and they trap thousands of wild boar and euthanize them to kind of mitigate the damage that they're causing and try and kind of slow the population growth. And despite that extensive control, we still see almost 4 times more abundant in terms of population size. And so wild boar really seem to have benefited from the absence of humans from this landscape. Similarly, Japanese macaques, again, this is a highly adaptable animal. They constantly cause issues in terms of raiding crops and damaging property. Here in both the exclusion and restricted zones, we see significantly more macaques in these areas than in the areas where people occur. And NPR did a story about the macaques and maybe a little bit about wild boar as well a year or two ago. You might check this out if you have any interest in that. They basically are going around with a former resident who's moved back to his house, an elderly gentleman, and he's basically become responsible for kind of chasing away these macaques that are basically coming into the town that the people are trying to repopulate and wreaking havoc. And so it's just a few minute story on this guy's adventures trying to chase away these macaques. And so it'll give you a good feel for some of the issues that some of these residents are facing as they're trying to return. And this is a common sighting when you go into certain parts of the exclusion zone. And so this is a troop of macaques that's actually moved into some of these houses in the exclusion zone. This is a house that almost every time we drive by it, they're either out in the yard or up on the roof. And when you drive by, they often jump into one of the broken windows and go in the house. And so they've really found creative ways of adapting to these new habitats that have opened up since humans have left the landscape. What that's done is create a real challenging situation in terms of human wildlife conflicts, and for a number of different ways. On the left here, this is a wild boar that these are those government trappers. They went out and this is an abandoned school. You can see the playground in the backyard there. A lot of the trapping that happens now in these areas is done in these urban centers. This is a fairly urbanized area. This is pretty similar to what Athens looks like, for example. And so they've got their traps in driveways, in schools, in parking lots, and that's where they're catching a lot of these animals. They've actually moved in and started to occupy a lot of these habitats that historically they would not have ventured there just because of the presence of people, which has created a number of different issues. One, as I mentioned, like with the macaques, it's created challenges for people who are trying to move back to their homes, but also from a radiological perspective, here on the right, that's boar rooting damage that's almost a half meter deep. It's almost up to my waist, and they're basically overturning the soil, almost like tilling an agricultural field. And what this does is it's constantly redistributing the radionuclides that have settled in the soil. And so we've got some studies now. I don't have any data to show you, but basically what we're demonstrating is that this rooting is changing the distribution of cesium, which is one of the radionuclides of concern on the landscape. Normally it migrates into the soil and becomes less and less available as it moves down, but boar are potentially keeping that contamination near the surface. So it's creating a number of different human and wildlife issues and environmental issues that the government there is trying to address. Now, the one exception is the Japanese cirro. As I mentioned, all the other species either showed no effect across the zones or were positively influenced by the absence of people. The exception is the Japanese cirro. And when we first started to explore these data, this was one that was really difficult to kind of wrap our heads around. We see lots of evidence of young cirro. They're clearly reproducing here. There's no evidence to suggest that they're directly impacted in some way, although this is not a heavily studied species from that perspective. But one thing that we did discover is that cirro are really sensitive to competition with other ungulates. And we've been able to demonstrate that wild boar are really abundant inside the exclusion zone. And so one of our hypotheses is that it's possible that the boar are simply displacing the cirro and kind of pushing them into the areas where there's people, because cirro are also sensitive to human presence. And so we would not necessarily expect them in areas where there are people. Keep in mind, though, this mountain range there where we're seeing these cirro, this is really remote. It's not, when I say populated, it's not like there are houses everywhere. There's tiny little villages in some of the valleys and some cropping there, but it's not major cities like along the coast. So this is a species that is intriguing. There's a couple of different hypotheses that we're exploring, and I think there'll be some interesting research to come on what's driving this distribution. And so, like Chernobyl, we wanted to tie all this together with some movement data. GPS technology has come a long ways in the past decade or two, and so we wanted to leverage this to try and better understand how these animals are interfacing with these novel environments. So, like Chernobyl, we put these radio collars that have dosimeters in them on wild boar over in Chernobyl or over in Fukushima. Here's a boar you can see again trapped in the middle of a town. Although we do have some collared in some of the more remote areas. This is a Malaysian. This is a palm civet on the upper right. That's a species we've been putting radio collars on, as well as a rat snake, a Japanese rat snake on the bottom right. We've been doing a lot of studies on these rat snakes because they're abundant, and they also sit on the ground. They spend some time in the trees, but a lot of time on the ground. So they're in direct contact with radiation. That's where, as I mentioned, a lot of the radiation is in the soil. And so they're a good model species for that. But we've also equipped these animals. The boar has that electronic dosimeter. The snake and the civet have these passive dosimeters. That doesn't give us real-time information on radiation, but it gives us over the lifetime of when that collar's on the animal, what its exposure is, to try and map exposure on the landscape. And unfortunately, I don't have time to go into tremendous detail on some of these movement studies, but kind of the main takeaway theme from all these species that we've collared so far in Japan is that all these animals are making really extensive use of some of these human-dominated areas. Even some of the animals in the highlands, in the mountains, are extensively using abandoned structures. On the upper left there, that's a wild boar that basically moves from one backyard to another. A lot of these Japanese houses have really wonderful gardens and fruit trees, and so there are persimmons and things that are plentiful in these areas that these animals are taking advantage of. In fact, that's a boar trap on the bottom left that is in someone's driveway where that boar was captured. That's a rat snake in the middle that was caught inside a barn. It actually was caught along a road, but it moved and then kind of set up shop inside a barn. That's where we kept tracking it to. And then bottom right, that's us tracking a palm civet kind of moving into some of these abandoned houses, even during the summertime. And so when we actually do some modeling of the data, we see really extensive use across these species of former crop areas and urban areas. And so collectively, this is all kind of, again, building this storyline that these animals are probably increasing in abundance, not because there's less pressure or harvest pressure or anything like that. There's just all this new habitat that wasn't available to them prior to that, and they've moved into these landscapes and are really exploiting it. One of the other things that we've started to look at, and we're actually looking at it with GPS data now, this is based on camera data, are activity patterns of wild boar. And one of the reasons we decided to look at this is, this picture on the left is one we just snapped while driving down the road there. But this is a routine sighting in Fukushima when you get into the exclusion zone, seeing wild boar out walking on roads in the middle of the day. And we don't really see this in some of the other areas. And when we actually look at the camera data, we see a significant difference in activity patterns depending on where the animal is. And actually in the exclusion zone, these animals are significantly more likely to be active during the day. They haven't shifted to be completely not diurnal, but they are almost twice as active during the day in the exclusion zone as they are in the area where people live. So this is some evidence that these animals not only are potentially adapting to exploit some of the more urban areas they couldn't use before, but they're also shifting some of their activity periods. And so we've got a number of boar that are radio collared at the moment that we're analyzing to try and validate that with some more fine scale spatial data. And so ultimately where we're going with all this is trying to understand what the potential health effects are. And so most of these things that I've been talking about to this point are population level studies, individual level studies, but what are the ultimate health implications? And in Chernobyl, as I showed you early on in the presentation, these animals are exposed to high levels of radiation. See the same thing in Fukushima. All the literature points to these animals, accumulating high levels of radionuclides in their body tissues. But ultimately, what does that mean for that animal? Are there consequences for that animal in terms of potential health effects? And so we know from medical studies, particularly on humans and lab animals, that radiation can have pretty severe reproductive effects. And so we're doing studies on wild boar in particular on both the male side and the female side, looking at mutations, looking at cell counts, things of that nature. And I don't have those results to share with you just yet, but all of our preliminary data point to the fact that we're not seeing any major impacts in terms of number of follicles in ovaries and things of that nature. And so that work's still ongoing, but all signs to this point to nothing, at least obviously detrimental going on there. And so we've actually dug into an even more fine scale, looking at the molecular level. And these are collaborative projects between my lab, other labs, and Colorado State University, where we're looking at dicentrics and telomeres. And so these are areas, again, that are known to be sensitive to radiation exposure. These are things that we commonly look at in the medical field, or medical researchers do anyways. Astronauts, when they go into space, are blasted with high levels of radiation. These are the kinds of things that they monitor in astronauts. And same thing with cataracts. We know that eyes are sensitive to radiation exposure, and certain types of radiation can cause certain types of cataracts. And these are all studies we've completed. We've published these results. And as you can see, we're just not seeing any detrimental effects, whether it's dicentrics, whether it's telomere lengths, whether it's cataracts. We're not seeing increased numbers of any of these relative to radiation exposure. And this likely reflects, like I said, we know that these things are impacted from radiation. And so what this suggests is that the animals in Fukushima are just not receiving levels of radiation that are high enough to actually trigger some of these impacts. And so, this all points to kind of higher thresholds. And one thing that I didn't mention early on that I probably should have is what's unique about the Chernobyl and Fukushima landscapes is this is chronic long-term exposure. These animals are just immersed in radiation exposure day in, day out. Everything they eat, everything they drink, everywhere they go, they're exposed to it. A lot of our knowledge with radiation exposure comes to really acute blasts of radiation exposure, usually from the medical field. And so what's not well known is kind of the impacts of these longer, relatively low dose exposures compared to these high blasts of radiation, where we know there's really detrimental impacts. And so these studies are all suggesting that, at least at these doses, there's just not significant impacts. The only study we've done to this point, and this is a paper that's currently in review, that shows any kind of evidence of potential impacts, is this microbiome study on wild boar. And so this is a Fukushima study that we've just submitted, where we sampled wild boar from within the exclusion zone, highly contaminated areas, and then wild boar from really low levels of contamination, dozens or hundreds of kilometers away. And we actually characterized the microbiome community across 7 different locations in the gut to look at how where you are in the gut influences your community, and ultimately how radiation exposure might be influencing that gut composition. And what these results are suggesting is that potentially there's some really slight changes in your gut microbiome if you're chronically exposed to radiation. The challenge here is some of our control animals come from areas of higher elevation. And so it's a little bit unclear whether or not that's an elevation issue or a radiation issue. But nonetheless, this does suggest that there's potentially the gut microbiome might be a sensitive endpoint to radiation, and something that we probably should dig into a little bit further when we are looking for these kind of impacts. And so just a final slide here, just to kind of wrap up and give you some of my takeaways from these dozens of studies that we've done to this point. So when you take all this research, collectively, we're just not seeing any evidence that wildlife populations are being suppressed at the population level in these areas. In fact, we're seeing similar or higher densities for some species than other nature reserves. And we're also seeing natural population growth, lots of young being born in these areas. And so, crystal clear evidence that these are self-sustaining populations. And when you step back and think about that, for a population to be suppressed, I'll talk about wild boar because that's a species I study pretty extensively. You need to remove about 30%, or here in the Southeast where they reproduce year round, 60, 70% of them every year. But over in Chernobyl, for example, you'd have to remove maybe 1/3 of them every year just to stabilize population growth of an animal like a wild boar. And this just suggests that if there are impacts, it's not impacting enough animals to actually curb population growth. And in fact, any impacts, if they are happening, clearly aren't happening at the population level. They're likely happening at the individual or molecular level. And from the studies that we've been able to finish so far, and from the few others that we have that are ongoing, it's really likely that there's only a few endpoints that are going to be sensitive to radiation exposure, and those endpoints are probably not extremely detrimental to the survival of those individuals or the species. And so kind of the take-home message for me for all of this is that we all know that humans have negative impacts on the environment. We have to cut down forests to have houses. We have to plant crops. We have to just clear land for various needs for humans. We all know that those exercises, those activities have impacts. And so what this kind of is a reminder for me is that, those impacts are more detrimental to wildlife than even some of these extreme nuclear accidents. So not to in any way suggest that these are good things, but if there's any sort of bright light, it is to suggest that animals seem to be on the surface, at least from a large mammal perspective, to be doing okay in these areas. And so I guess to wrap up here, this is not research that I've done on my own by any means. There are dozens and dozens of really brilliant collaborators from around the world that have been involved in these studies and have led these studies, graduate students, postdocs, faculty elsewhere. And I also just wanted to acknowledge the tremendous colleagues and scientists in Ukraine and Belarus that have been instrumental in doing all this work that are just severely upended right now because of all the incidents that are going on there. And so kind of we've been thinking about them lately. And with that, I will open it up. I'm sure we have time for questions, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jim. That was fascinating. And just the volume of data that you've collected just blows me away with that research. So yes, I agree. Let's open it up for a few questions. And if you're attending and have a question, you can either type it into the Q&A or the chat, or if you, at the bottom of your screen, click the raise hand button, I can unmute you and let you ask your question out loud. So let's take some questions. And maybe while you're thinking, I'll throw one out there. I mean, listening to this, Jim, it seems like you've made a pretty strong case, and I think at the end you stated it that these are important nature reserves or functioning that way. But at the beginning you said that there is some equally strong argument that these are incredible wildlife sinks. What is the basis for that point of view? And just curious why someone would feel that way.
Yeah, there's been a number of studies that have looked at rodents and some birds in particular, and they've found really reduced populations and reduced diversity of certain species in some of the more contaminated areas. And in some of these areas, they found hardly any animals in areas with radiation exposure that would be considered like background levels in England, for example. And so some of these findings have really, kind of, I don't know, as scientists, we're trained to question, question data and kind of validate things. And there's been a lot of brilliant radioecologists who have really challenged kind of the radiation measurements that were used in some of those areas and the ability of those studies to tease out confounding variables. And one of the big confounding variables in some of those studies was the use of the red forest as a contaminated site. And as I mentioned, it's no different than if you were to go out into Whitehall Forest or somewhere near Athens and clear cut it and bury all the trees in sand, and 20 years later come back and see what wildlife are there. That's going to be different than what used to be there just because of the habitat changes. So there's been a number of studies that have kind of challenged some of the conclusions of some of those studies, and part of it also stems from the fact that there's a lot of fantastic researchers doing work there, but it's difficult to do these long-term large studies. And so there's just prior to a decade ago or so, just not enough people working in that space. And the more people who've started to work in that space, the more of these other sort of perspectives are coming out.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's a question in the Q&A from Allison Krausman. She says, do you know how radiation levels from these acute disasters that you've talked about, how that compares to radiation from shellings and bombing that is occurring now?
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I guess from what I've read, which is probably the same as any of you, is that none of the bombs that are being used at the moment have any sort of radiation in them, but there's a concern that if one were to hit near the reactor, or one of these power plants that's, was hit, a couple weeks ago, where that was on fire, that could disseminate some radiation. So yeah, so to my knowledge, everything that I've seen and heard, there's been no substantial releases, and that's been really closely monitored. What has been elevated, and this is what I've just heard through some reports, through some people, through agencies that are monitoring over there, is there's been some elevated levels, probably from dust being kicked up in the exclusion zone, not levels that would be concerning, and not levels that are transferring very far, but the people who are kind of actively in that area are, there's some slightly elevated levels. And so anytime you kind of stir up the soil, that's why if you saw that mask that I was wearing when I was digging that wolf trap, I was wearing a full face mask. The reason for that is because the radiation particles are in the soil. And so when you disturb that soil, you can inhale them. And so anytime there's soil disturbance, we get concerned about that. So far, I've not heard any evidence that there's any issues, but with everything going on there, that's obviously a major concern that people have.
Yeah, let's hope it stays that way.
For sure.
Yeah. Another question in the Q&A regarding wolves and their kind of dispersal. She says, or someone says, what are the broader implications for wolves living in these highly contaminated zones that disperse and move away to ecosystems outside of the exclusion zone? Can this form of radiation that they're bringing outside of the zone have impacts on wildlife and animal populations outside of Ukraine and Belarus?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't know that we know all the answers to that at this point. So we know that acute radiation exposure causes some DNA damage, and we know that animals, humans as well, have powerful mechanisms to kind of repair DNA damage. And so these animals have kind of lived under generations of radiation exposure. And so there are some theories out there as to, animals have kind of a heightened immune response, if you will, because they're kind of constantly living under this kind of this stress, this chronic stressor. And so in terms of the health of those animals and their offspring, I don't think we have a good idea of what potential mutations they could pass on or things like that. But everything that I've seen thus far suggests that we're not seeing these major mutations and detrimental effects that would be carried on. So, but I think that's certainly something that people should be exploring a little bit further, especially for animals like wolves that can disperse, hundreds or more of miles. What it also has the potential on the other side. So for an animal that could be consumed, that's also a concern. So, a wild boar, for example, that's within Chernobyl, but then leaves and is harvested by a hunter. There's actually hunting clubs that are right outside Chernobyl. Those animals, those people could be exposed to very high levels of radiation if they were to eat some of those animals. So that's a much more localized concern, kind of human concern. But in terms of radiation exposure, the last point I'll make is it's called depuration. So when animals move from a contaminated area to an uncontaminated area, like that wolf, for example, your body processes radiocesium in particular, like potassium. Your body uses up, it seeks it out. And so if you're in a potassium-rich environment, for example, your body won't take up much radiation. But when you move from that contaminated area, your body's basically excreting that radiation. And so the studies that have been done in fish and amphibians and chickens have shown that in just a couple of weeks, an animal can go from extremely contaminated to almost background levels of contamination because they've excreted those contaminants. So once the animal's outside the exclusion zone, in terms of that animal being contaminated, that's not really a concern. The only concern would be whether or not it's able to kind of transfer any mutations or things like that.
Interesting. Yeah, we've got a couple more questions that have come in. First, I don't know if you're seeing these on your screen too, but question, do foresee humans ever living within these exclusion zones that are currently, still uninhabitable for humans, and if so, what's a time frame that might be possible safely?
Yeah, that is one of the big questions for these areas of at what threshold do you evacuate people, have them abandon their lives? Generations in both of these areas had to be evacuated, never to return, which has had severe kind of mental health impacts on these people, and other kind of chronic health impacts in both Chernobyl and Fukushima. That's been really well documented, that people that have been evacuated have really been impacted kind of physically and mentally because of that. And so that's a really difficult question. And I'm glad I'm not a politician that needs to make those decisions. But there's an interesting documentary and book. I think it's called The Babushkas of Chernobyl. You might look into that. So after Chernobyl, they moved these people out, and there's a group of elderly people who moved back. They defied the government and moved back into the Chernobyl exclusion zone, and they moved them out again, and they moved back, and they moved. Eventually, we're not talking about a lot of people, but a small number of people. They just basically moved back and said, we're living here. This is where we're from. We're not leaving. And I think there's some evidence that some of those people have outlived some of their counterparts that were evacuated. So, no, well, especially given what's going on today in Chernobyl, I don't foresee that people moving in there for quite some time. The plan there has not been for people to move back. That's been kind of in Belarus designated as a wildlife reserve. In Chernobyl, in Ukraine, it's been kind of off limits for humans to live, but people could go back. And so I don't think we're talking, I think we're talking centuries perhaps. But in Fukushima, they're actively trying to remediate that landscape and encourage people to move back and incentivize people to move back. And as I showed there, they've actually been able to open up huge portions of that exclusion zone for people to move back. And I think, all that's being determined based on radiation levels reaching certain thresholds. And so as areas of that exclusion zone meet those thresholds, I think it's 1 millisievert a year. Those are probably meaningless numbers, but that's kind of the threshold. Once they are reduced to that amount, they're opening them back up for people. So, it's conceivable that in our lifetimes, more areas of Fukushima will continue to be opened up for people.
Yeah. Okay. I think, given the time, one last question that is asking for some guidance from you as a researcher, and the question is, have you studied Russian, Ukrainian, or Japanese to facilitate communication in the course of this international research? And the follow-up question, how do you cope with climate grief while studying animals so significantly impacted by human activity?
Yeah, those are both good questions. The first one, I could probably spend a whole seminar. I've actually thought about giving a whole seminar on that. International work is incredibly challenging for reasons that I can't get into right now, but you could imagine. And language is one of those challenges, both in Belarus. I don't speak Russian. They don't speak English. Some of the researchers do. And that's created some unique challenges. I actually tried learning Russian when we started, and I just was too busy to learn it well enough to speak fluently. So what we ended up doing is hiring a biologist in Chernobyl that has a PhD, is a researcher, but has a private business, actually, kind of like a tourism business. And so he's kind of out of practice as a scientist, but has that passion for scientists. But he also speaks English really well because he's a tour guide, he's a birder. And so we found him, hired him, and he basically accompanies us on all of our research trips. So anytime he's with us, we're pretty well covered there. And so that's been a creative way I've found in Fukushima, or excuse me, in Chernobyl, to kind of facilitate that research. And he's also a tremendous help in the field. In Fukushima, a lot of my grad students have them take Japanese courses, and so that's really helped. And there too, often kind of just tag along with researchers that speak both languages. So we've been able to make it work, but it's definitely a wrinkle that's thrown into it. And with the climate issues, I've started to get a little bit more into that. I actually have a really large project on apex predators in Africa right now, where we're studying lions and hyenas and leopards and cheetahs in a really arid part of southern Africa, and the effects of protected areas and human settlements that are encroaching in protected areas, and kind of loss of livestock and things. So another substantial human wildlife issue, and climate has really become front and center of that, because these animals depend on water for their daily lives. Without water, they can't exist in that area, and it's a desert much of the year. And so that's been really both fascinating and challenging to kind of dig into some of that work on how we can conserve some of these species, in the face of some of these climate changes.
Excellent. Well, this has been incredible, Jim. I really appreciate your time and expertise. And I know we're all, as you mentioned, thinking about your colleagues and collaborators in Ukraine. And I hope that this current crisis ends soon. For our attendees that are still here, I would encourage you to check out the Beasley Lab website. You can just Google James Beasley UGA and it should pop up. There's a lot of the research that has been published is available there, and it's a great way to keep up on the news and updates from what's coming out of Jim's lab. So thank you again very much, Jim, and I look forward to meeting you in person one of these days. And thank you all for attending.
Great, thank you so much for the invite, and it's been a pleasure, and I appreciate it.
Yep, excellent. Well, thanks everyone, and we'll say goodnight. I'll end the show now. Thanks again, Jim.
All right, thank you.